Hey folks, if you're a fan of horror or narrative-driven games, I've got something special for you today, since I'll be talking about Insert Disc 5's time-looping-centric RPG, In Stars and Time, which builds upon their earlier title, Start Again, a Prologue. Not to be confused with the demo, it's its own separate game. Anyways, I've been wanting to talk about this ever since the 2023 Indie Cup Canada, since it was one of the games I judged, and as it stands, the embargo is now over and my editors found some time, which means I can finally dive into it and ask the important question. Namely, was Stars in Time a stellar title with a bright future, or did this time-traveling tale stall? I'm your host Arlian, let's find out together. The kingdom of Vogard is in peril, beset by a great and terrible stillness as time itself is being gradually halted, trapping its citizens within an endless moment. The culprit is a mysterious figure known as the King, whose sudden appearance was accompanied by the sadnesses. Monsters who only serve to further the confusion that consumed the countryside. But hope remains. 4 great heroes have risen up to the challenge. Mirabelle, the Handmaiden, Isabeau, the Defender, Odile, the Researcher, and Siffrin, the Traveler. And then Bonnie's along for the ride. Bolstered by the experience they've gained over the course of their journey, they're now ready to venture into the heart of the House of Change and challenge the King, even as he lurks at its heart. Too bad Siffrin manages to suffer a brutal, horrible death almost immediately, dooming his companions to confront the King alone. Or does it? For reasons unknown, he's returned to the prior day, but with his knowledge of what happened intact. And only his. Every new life, every repetition of those 2 days gets him one step closer to the King, but how long can he keep his secret from his friends, especially as the weight of his myriad deaths add up? And what about the loop itself? What mysteries lie at its heart? It's a hell of a premise, even with the Steam page giving a heads up that Groundhog Day shenanigans are at the heart of this tale. And I'll admit, I did not expect it to take the turns that it does. There's just something about it, a sort of intrinsic sense of wholesomeness as it takes its time introducing you to its cast of characters and the warmth that exists between the heroes. Even as you plunge into the house, there's this light-hearted energy to the whole thing, given that your enemies are goofy-looking critters whose names quite literally translate to things associated with sadness and suffering. Okay, maybe that was a little hint. Still, when the characters are wielding attack magic centered around rock, paper, scissors, and this is presented as a totally normal part of the world, you can forgive me for getting sucked in and then suckered by its Saturday morning cartoon vibes. And then reality ensues. Here's the thing though, while this was clever in and of itself, that's barely scratching the surface. There is so much going on in Stars in Time because it handles the ideas at its core with a surprising degree of maturity. What would you do when faced with the frustration of dying repeatedly, of failing to protect your friends or stalling in your quest? It wouldn't be inaccurate to call this game a character study since you're introduced to Siffrin and then made to witness how he adapts to the hurdles put in his path, the journey he's forced to take, and, well, it's not exactly pretty. Like, don't get me wrong, I'm not trying to say it's an unrelenting roller coaster of misery porn. There is still heart to be found in it, as it explores both the protagonist and the relationships they hold with their companions. Also, a fair amount of humor. That said, it wouldn't be wrong to say that the presence of these elements often serves to further hammer home the bleaker story bits. To the point that this is one of the darker games I've played this year, and that's despite the fact that I've also tackled both the Library of Ruina and Limbus Company in 2023. That said, this sense of cleverness isn't just limited to the way it artfully uses juxtaposition to hurt you. It also extends to how In Stars and Times presents its story. For instance, as Siffrin continues to progress through the loops, they become increasingly aware of what the future holds. Something which gradually influences the way they speak with and treat characters, as well as altering how they describe the objects they encounter or even how they interact with them. Quite frankly, I loved this detail since not only did it complement the idea of the time loops, it also served to mitigate some of the tedium that would normally be present due to the game's intrinsically iterative nature. Those small bits of flavor provide a steady trickle of characterization and even the occasional nugget of information that helps to maintain a sense of progressing the story. Even if you're like me and just fiddling around the house looping through time like a macabre maniac. But wait! There's more! See, while the dialogue does change, there does come a point where you'll encounter something you've heard before. That said, you're not helpless since the game provides you the option to just disassociate and tune out until the conversation's done, which also feels fitting. Admittedly, you can miss out on variant dialogue this way, including some small glimpses of Siffrin's internal monologues, but if it's especially important, the game will snap you out of the fugue so you don't miss anything important. Which will definitely happen as you progress. Oh boy! Here's the thing though. While I've certainly focused a lot of energy on the central narrative for In Stars and Time, that's not all there is. There's a surprising amount of side content to explore, to the point that I found myself getting sidetracked for a monstrous amount of time. There's just a staggering amount of things to do, and even those quests which were tied to mechanic rewards would still wind up serving as a foundation for future story beats. That said, some of the most meaningful tangents I went on were wholly narrative in nature. Bits of world building seeded throughout the experience that provide a deeper understanding of the world and the characters. And in turn, an understanding that there are worse things that exist at the periphery of the experience. It's the sort of thing that'll probably provide fodder for a MatPat video someday. That said, I really do recommend pursuing these because not only do they lead to some great scenes in the moment, there's also a good number that help to further expand the ending. That said, I haven't really tackled the gameplay yet now, have I? I've gone on a few related tangents, so let's just dive in at this point. Mechanically speaking, In Stars and Time is an RPG, but the more you progress, the more this takes a backseat to its narrative, exploration, and investigation elements. Which is a bit surprising since the combat's pretty fun. First off, while the whole rock, paper, scissors thing does seem pretty simple at a glance, the fact that your comrades have specific elements means certain enemies will give them a harder time and potentially wreck them, forcing you to adjust your strategy from fight to fight. Admittedly, the bestiary isn't tremendously broad, especially when you take into account that some of the enemies are variants of another one, albeit with a different craft type, but even still, they'll have mechanics you'll need to be mindful of, especially when you reach the bosses. They all have their specific quirks to manage, which helps to flavor the fight, and their elemental affinities and the way they play with those will usually have you reaching further into the character's kits than you normally would. Specifically, abusing jackpots and turn swaps. So, while your party does have pretty distinct differences in the types of crafts they can wield, if you do manage to play 5 of the same type in a row, you'll deal massive damage of that type to everything in the fight. Also reviving any downed characters and healing everyone. It's a mechanic that can really help to turn the tide and even save a character that's been stopped in time, a feat normally reserved for the handmaiden character. While this can be achieved by having an incompatible character use an item, buff, or even just guard, you can also expedite the process by swapping your turn, which helps to make the fights more dynamic. It also means that you can very quickly get a clutch heal in or buff the party in case you mess up, because, well, your abilities have some distinct limitations. While you don't have to fuss about MP, all of your skills have cooldowns, some of which are pretty hefty, and your buffs only last for 3 turns, which, if your characters wind up extremely fast, can lead to some awkward moments where your defenses fall apart before an enemy attacks. It's definitely spicy, until it isn't. First off, while the companions have their levels reset at the start of each loop, Siffrin's aren't, and that only compounds itself further as you move forward. That said, you're also given the option of saving your comrades' levels once you're in the House of Change, so if you have the option to loop ahead to a given juncture, well, things get easier. And it's not just levels you keep. While you need to find consumables every loop, any equipment you find is a permanent addition, further allowing you to buff your friends and adjust your strategy. Just mind the paradoxes. So yeah, revisiting the house, and you will need to do so a fair amount, is significantly less painful than you'd expect. It helps too that there's no random encounters, that you can sneak past enemies or even just flee. Or, I guess, horrify enemies to such an extreme that they run in terror from you, because that's a whole thing. Tied to the game's memory system. Remember those optional scenes I mentioned? Well, one of the rewards they can give you are memories for your characters, and yeah, that's one. Which meant I could just focus on the exploration elements, and there is a lot to do. Really, navigating the House of Change is a process, and while the way forward is initially pretty straightforward, it's not long before you'll find yourself stuck. Figuratively and literally, there are times where you'll simply lock yourself out of being able to delve deeper. What's neat here is the game is kind enough to tell you when you've soft-locked your current loop, which means you'll never really be stuck searching for a path that doesn't exist. Instead, you can just unalive yourself and return to an earlier checkpoint in order to figure out what you may have missed or what you're supposed to do. And late game, you get even more options since you can start a floor with all of its locked doors already solved, avoiding unnecessary backtracking. Really, the only cost comes in the form of Memories of Skirmish, a resource you get from bullying monsters, which I had in such large surplus that I was frequently zipping around the map. Which, I should note, is free if you're resetting your progress on the current floor or backtracking. Suffice to say, I went on some pretty morbid expeditions in order to satisfy my curiosity about what the house had in store for me. Also, resetting in the village is the funniest thing imaginable. Still, I've said my piece on that segment, which means let's get into the presentation, and honestly, I think I've already tackled this to some degree. In Stars in Time has a lovely and legitimately disarming art style that I think lends a lot to the experience. It looks great, and I enjoyed that the enemy designs were creative and useful if you were paying attention, so you can figure out their elements from that. That said, what I loved the most was all the portraits. All the characters are provided a wide array of expressions for their dialogue sections, and it just helps everything sink in so nicely. This actually extends to the character portraits during battle too, since they're not actually static. Your party members will flinch when hit, and they even have different portraits when they're badly wounded or using skills. It's a nice detail. There's also some neat scenes you can unlock over the course of your journey that actually had me wishing there was a gallery mode. Also, the music. God. I honestly found this to be another interesting element of the game because you'll hear the soundtrack evolve over the course of your loops as familiar motifs crop up in new ways. It's absolutely fabulous and only slightly gut-wrenching. But yeah, that has been a fair bit, so let's bring things to a close, shall we? And quite honestly, In Stars in Time is a trip, a journey that is well worth taking given that it manages to craft a compelling story full of mystery and a fair share of misery. Even after I'd finished the game and arrived at its climax, I still found myself so thoroughly invested in its world, in all of the ideas that it crafted, compelled by the small mysteries left in the wake of its central plot. It is just that good. And it certainly helped to make exploring the house a treat throughout the entirety of the journey. That sense of discovery remained with me well into the tail end of my adventures into the House of Change. Admittedly, I can't say the same about the combat because while it certainly starts out compelling, there does hit a point where it becomes fairly rote. That said, since the game does provide you with a broad array of ways that you can bypass most of its fights, a lot of the tedium rests more on you than it by that point. It's just so well crafted from top to bottom and leaves me hoping to see more from this developer, as well as the possibility that we may revisit this game's world even if it's from a different pair of eyes. Which is a whole lot of words to say that I think this is a crit hit. It's just so well done to the point that I keep rambling about it. Even if RPGs aren't normally your thing, give it a crack. The story is well worth it. Also, just a brief moment taken here to shout out to my Patreon supporters, Green Witch Babby and Andy Noted. You are, as ever, absolutely phenomenal for helping to put a little bit of extra food on me and my cat's table. Also, thank you to Shrimp Mania for being my first Patreon supporter. I really do love it. Anywho, to everyone else watching, thanks for tuning in. If you have something to say, leave a comment, and if you enjoy my efforts to create new indie reviews and interviews, hit subscribe and the bell. For a link to my Discord, the Crit Hit Cauldron, check the description. There's also a link to my Patreon if you want to see reviews early or just want to support the channel. And my merch house for neat swag like the Crit Hit coffee mugs. That said, I'll catch you on the next episode of Crit Hit. Take care till then, folks.